fall of 1979, when I arrived to begin teaching at Wartburg Seminary, I was invited to give a lecture at Founders Day in October. Andrea de Groot-Nesdal, who had graduated from Wartburg just a year or so before, happened to be there and came up to me afterwards. I didn't know her at the time, and she says, "Norma, I've been waiting for years for you to come." That gave me an idea of how much students had hungered to have a woman professor. The women certainly knew it, but the men had been hungering too. That first January, for January interim, I decided to offer an interim for us to go visit women clergy, because the handful of women students on campus at the time, most of them had not ever seen a woman pastor. We fit into my car, and we picked a pastor in a rural area named April Ulring Larson. And we visited another woman in the Madison area, Andrea de Groot-Nesdal. These women, and not too many years later, would go on to become April, the first woman bishop, and Andrea, the second woman bishop in the ELCA. We also went to visit Connie Kleingartner, and she later became a professor at Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, and unfortunately died just this past year. Phyllis Anderson, the first woman seminary president in the ELCA, was also a Wartburg graduate, and she was a kind of colleague to me when I was here, because she was working on her PhD and doing some work with women and doing some things on campus as well. Bonnie Jensen was a student in her senior year, and she went on to become the first woman head of global mission. So all of these women who have gone on to become leaders in our church, there was something about being here together. Even before I came, the women at Wartburg and University of Dubuque Theological Seminary just across town had been gathering, and so we firmed that up and gathered at least once a month. And each year the women gathered at Wartburg, and first we could gather in a small circle, but later it was a large circle. But each year they wanted us all to gather and all to tell our stories. That was so important. One time I remember the women had an overnight retreat at my house, and we had a small house, but we all fit. Burton and our boys came up and stayed overnight at Wartburg. I did go out and become known in the church. I served on many task force and commissions, I think continuously for the first 15 years that I was here. First, for the American Lutheran Church, a study on ordination. And then in 1982, when the ALC, the LCA, and the AELC voted to prepare to become a new Lutheran church, there was much work to do, and I served on the first major task force on church and society, and then on the study of ministry. And then I thought, well, that work is done, but then came up an important study on theological education, and again, as the only woman here, was asked to serve. Well, you couldn't say no to that. The issues were too important about numbers and locations of seminaries. And then at 1988, when the new Lutheran Church came into being, the issues of ministry had not been settled, so there needed to be a task force on the study of ministry that would meet for the next, well, it was to be 6, but it turned out to be 5 years. So there was much work in the broader church. Likewise, I did a lot of speaking and traveling, and those were wonderful opportunities. But it was good that after a few years there were other women that could be called upon for some of these tasks. But I have been privileged over the years to serve not only in this church, but also globally. Early on in the 1980s for a Lutheran World Federation study on ministry. And then actually, not long ago, an important work on engendering theological education, working together with leaders from churches and seminaries all around the world. And just 2 months ago, actually, I returned from Germany participating in a Lutheran World Federation convocation of 120 people from 30 countries on theology and the life of the churches. For 6.5 years, I was the only woman at Wartburg Seminary. But a couple of years after I was here, Trinity Lutheran in Columbus, Ohio, called their first woman professor, Mary Hughes. The LCA did have a couple of women serving as professors in their seminaries. But the 3 seminaries of the ALC, our professors gathered at a meeting in Rochester, Minnesota, all these professors from all these seminaries, a large group of men and 2 women. And we asked each other, should we sit together or should we not sit together? Now this seems like a small question, but it was one that people were always noticing. Here at chapel or wherever we were, if women sat together, well, they must be plotting to overthrow the men. But if we didn't sit together, then they must be fighting. People were always looking at that. There was fear of women's power. There was fear of women gathering. It was important for women to gather. Actually, in those first year, there was a woman pastor over here in Kansas and maybe 1 or 2 in Illinois, but most had not gotten together. And I remember in the early 80s when there was the first time there was a gathering of women ordained in the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church in the ALC, again in Rochester, Minnesota, and for that room to be filled with women clergy was just an amazing blessing. But I think there was fear too, because the few men who were there, presidents of churches and so on, I remember they're making comments, and a number of them told stories about older sisters, and they'd always been intimidated by older sisters. I thought, what is this all about? But there was this sense that somehow if women, there was just one here, one here, the token stage, not unlike the token stage for African Americans or any group that seems to be the stranger, the alien, that somehow if you get these people together, well, it will be dangerous. We weren't dangerous at all. It was just wonderful to see each other. And I remember I was a preacher for that event, and the woman with whom I worked, we were at the end of the conference. You know how people kind of peel off, and so we thought, let's sing the people up into the sanctuary, and we did. And the Roman Catholic sisters, we were meeting in their retreat in their house. Were in the balcony praying for us and hearing us women clergy sing and worship together. And I remember saying to the group, you know, you don't have to be afraid of women. If we had all of it, there's a lot of us here and it's wonderful and the numbers are growing. But if we had all the men who are clergy in these church bodies, it would fill from here to the field out yonder. So it's not as if men need to be afraid of the growing numbers of women clergy. But until really very recently, and I can actually say till today, when we may be at a conference or wherever, when there's a group of women just happen to be together talking, inevitably a man will come up and say, well, what are you doing? You have to break this up. You're talking about us. Well, we probably weren't talking about the men, and why do they have to break women up? There's a projection that somehow women will also try to get to the top and knock others out in this kind of patriarchy, hierarchical system. But the feminist movement is about shared power and including others. When I had begun my PhD work, I did a research paper on the first women ordained in the American Lutheran Church. I sent out questionnaires. At that time, there were fewer than 100, and I got like 3/4 of them back. It was very interesting to see questions about styles of leadership. Almost all of them said they wanted to have a shared power sense of leadership. Even though many women who were at that time still being tutored by male professors in all-male seminaries were thinking they needed to adapt a strong leadership which is on top down. But gradually women and men were learning a style of leadership which didn't have to, you didn't have to break somebody up in order to have more people in the group, or you didn't have to exclude some to have all included. It was interesting because we would also gather for women's interseminary conferences. And again, women would sit in a circle, tell their stories, and we would find out from each other that the things that we were teaching, even though there's one professor here, one there, were all very similar. It's not as if we called each other up on the phone and had this big conspiracy. This is what we're going to do to take over the church. That was not it at all, but there was a sense about women's ways of being, which is collaborative and shared power, empowering of the laity. But over these many years, in teaching this way, men have found freedom in this style of leadership as well, in this collaborative style of leadership. So much so that a year ago, when we were using Letty Russell's The Church in the Round book in church administration class, men said, well, what's so unusual about this? That we've now come to the place where shared power and partnership are the natural way of leadership. Not that all is changed, but we've come a long way.